The clock on Conrad Rourke's wrist read 0247 when he decided they were going to die. Not the panicked kind of decision, not the kind that comes with shaking hands or a racing heart. After 20 years in naval special warfare, Rourke had learned that death, when it finally comes for you, announces itself quietly. Like a door closing in another room, you feel it more than hear it. He pressed the transmit button on his radio for what he believed was the last time. Any station, any station. This is SEAL Troop 2, Grid November Kilo 4478. We are in heavy contact. 6 personnel, taking fire from elevated positions both sides. No extraction possible. Ammunition critical. Any station, please respond. Static, the same static that had answered every call for the past 11 minutes. He tried once more. His voice did not waver. Troop 2, we have 14 armed hostiles. All exits blocked. We are surrounded. Ammunition critical. He paused. He looked at the men around him, each one pressed behind rock, each one burning through what little they had left. He looked at Doyle Callahan, who had been with him since Ramadi, who still had not said a single word since the first RPG went off. He looked at Corbett Sloan, 26 years old on his first deployment, who was doing everything right and who deserved a C-27. Rourke pressed the button one last time. We're dead. All of us. We're dead. He released the button, set the radio down, and picked up his rifle. What happened in the next 81 seconds would not be fully understood until morning. And even then, understanding it would take considerably longer than that, because what happened was not supposed to be possible. Not at that distance, not in that darkness, not by the person who did it. But we will get to that. First, you need to understand where they were and why they were there at all. The Korengal Valley does not forgive. The locals have a name for it that translates loosely to the place that swallows armies. They are not wrong. Alexander the Great moved through this region and kept moving. The British Empire tried twice and turned back both times. The Soviet Union spent a decade learning what the mountains already knew. And the United States, the most technologically advanced military force in the history of human civilization, came to Korengal with helicopters and satellites and precision-guided munitions and still buried good men in the dirt there. The valley runs roughly 6 miles north to south in Kunar province, in the eastern corner of Afghanistan, pressed hard against the Pakistani border. The walls rise on both sides to over 8,000 feet. The bottom is narrow in places, barely wide enough for a single vehicle track. Pine trees grow thick on the slopes, broken by rocky outcroppings and small villages that have been in the same locations for 400 years. The people who live here have been fighting outsiders since before the concept of Afghanistan existed as a nation, and they will be fighting them long after the current version of that nation is gone. In 2010, the United States Army made the decision to withdraw from Korengal. They had taken severe casualties there for years. The cost in blood and equipment had become difficult to justify in any language that the people making budget decisions could understand. They pulled out, destroyed what they could not take, and left the valley to itself. They did not stay gone. By 2019, the Special Operations Forces were operating regularly in the region again. Not in the same way, no forward operating bases, no prolonged presence. But missions came through, intelligence came through. The Haqqani network, which had been running weapons and fighters across the Pakistani border for decades, was still using the old trails. And someone in a building somewhere decided that 6 of the best trained operators in the American military should go find out exactly which trails they were using and exactly who was using them. That someone was not in the valley that night. He was almost certainly asleep in Jalalabad, with the air conditioning running. Conrad Rourke had been given a mission that seemed on paper entirely manageable. Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance. ISR. Go and observe, report, back, get out. 8 kilometers of movement through the night, reach the observation point. Watch the corridor where the Haqqani network was believed to be moving personnel and material from Pakistan, and be at the extraction point before dawn. Clean, simple. Rourke had run enough of these to know that clean and simple were words that lived in briefing rooms. They did not survive contact with actual terrain. They had inserted by halo at 2200 hours. High altitude, low opening, jumping from 25,000 feet in total darkness, using night vision and precise timing to land within a tight window in the valley below. The jump itself went exactly as planned. In Rourke's experience, when the easy part went perfectly, it was worth paying attention to what that might mean. The 6 of them assembled on the ground and under 4 minutes equipment checks completed without a word. That kind of silence is earned over years. It means every man knows what every other man is doing without having to look. Rourke led, Aldrich Pruitt pulled rear security. Between them, Owen Farrell on communications, Everett Madsen carrying his medical kit that weighed more than most people's carry-on luggage, and who had never once complained about this Corbett Sloan on the right flank, and Doyle Callahan, where he always was, wherever the heaviest part of the load needed to go. Callahan was 38 years old. He had the face of a man who had slept outdoors for half his life, which was not far from the truth. 15 years in naval special warfare. 7 deployments. He had been in buildings in Ramadi that no one put in official reports. He had been in valleys in Afghanistan that appeared on maps with different names than the ones the people who lived there used. He was the kind of man who made everyone around him feel without explanation that the situation was manageable. Before every mission without variation, he loaded 2 additional 30-round magazines and taped them to the left shoulder strap of his plate carrier. Extra weight, extra bulk. His teammates had asked about it exactly once. His answer had been 4 words. Rather be heavy, just in case. Nobody asked again. They moved for 4 hours through the mountain dark. 8 kilometers does not sound like much until you are doing it at altitude in full kit, in complete silence on terrain that has not been accurately mapped because no mapping agency has ever been able to stay long enough to get it right. They climbed steep ground where the footing was loose shale, and one wrong step could send rocks sliding into the dark below. They descended into draws where the coal pooled and sat in your lungs. They crossed a stream that was not on any map. They stopped twice when Farrell thought he heard movement on the ridge above them, and both times it was wind through the pines, which sounded enough like footsteps at 2 in the morning that you could not blame him for stopping. At 01:31, Farrell raised a closed fist. Everyone froze. He turned his head slowly and leaned toward Rourke. The words were barely breath. Radio traffic, old SOF frequency. Someone's transmitting on our old net. Rourke processed this in less time than it takes to describe. Old Special Operations Forces frequencies were supposed to be rotated out on a regular schedule. The fact that someone was transmitting on one in this valley at this hour meant either there had been a significant communications failure somewhere in the system or someone who should not have that frequency did. Neither option was good. The second option was considerably worse than the first. He made the call in real time, continued to the objective, mission still running. But everything changed: maximum alertness, slower movement, more frequent stops, and the particular quality of attention that experienced operators develop over years, the ability to monitor multiple inputs simultaneously without letting any one of them consume the focus that needed to stay distributed. They reached the observation area at 0230. The objective corridor lay below them along the valley floor. The ground gave a workable angle on the approach routes. They spread into position without needing to be told where to go, each man reading the terrain and placing himself correctly the way a practiced team does when the years of training have become reflex. For 17 minutes, nothing happened. The valley was dark and cold and still. Far to the south, a dog barked twice from somewhere near a village and then went quiet. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 4 degrees Celsius, and the wind came steadily from the northwest, carrying the specific smell of high-altitude pine forest at night, which is clean in a way that has nothing to do with safety. Then the night exploded. The first RPD hit the slope 15 feet to Rourke's left. The blast wave knocked him sideways into a boulder he could not see. His ears rang with the high-pitched tone that means the blast was close enough to matter, and the pressure wave has done something to your inner ear that will take hours to fully resolve. He was already moving before the ringing peaked, rolling left, finding cover behind the boulder weapon up scanning. The incoming fire came from both walls of the ravine simultaneously. From the right, at least 7 firing positions, shooting down at an angle that the terrain amplified. From the left, another 7. The geometry was nearly perfect. The kill zone was the narrow strip of ground where SEAL Troop 2 had been positioned. Whoever had placed those fighters had looked at this terrain on a map or in person and understood exactly what they were doing. The discipline of the attack was immediately apparent to Rourke. These were not fighters who had stumbled onto an American patrol in the dark. This was a prepared ambush. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had known their route, their timing, their exact location. He did not have time to think about what that meant. Not yet. Contact left, contact right. He did not need to say it, everyone already knew, but the call itself was a signal. It meant, I am alive, I am in command, stay on me. Callahan had the M24OB up and running in 4 seconds. The belt-fed machine gun began its conversation with the ridgeline to the right, deep rhythmic bursts that were less about precision and more about volume, about forcing heads down, about buying the seconds the rest of the team needed to find cover. It bought 30 seconds of reduced incoming fire, which was 30 seconds that mattered enormously. Pruitt pulled Sloan behind a rock outcropping on the left. Sloan had caught shrapnel from the RPG across his left forearm, not deep, not into the bone, but bleeding steadily in the way that arm wounds bleed. Madsen was moving toward him before anyone asked. Farrell worked the radio with the systematic patience of someone who has been trained to work the radio under conditions that make it very difficult to work the radio. Every frequency, every emergency call sign, every protocol. Nothing came back but static and the specific electronic noise of active jamming. Not bad equipment, not atmospheric interference, but a deliberate signal designed to occupy the exact frequencies they were using. Someone had known those frequencies too. Rourke did the math, and the math was terrible. 6 men in a prepared kill zone with jamming suppressing their communications against 14 fighters in elevated positions with angles of fire that negated most of their available cover. The correct tactical response required either close air support or a viable egress route. They had neither. The incorrect tactical responses all ended the same way. Callahan's M240B went silent. Rourke looked across to find Callahan already working the feed tray, clearing a jam with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done exactly this under fire more times than he has kept track of. The jam cleared in 11 seconds. 11 seconds in a sustained firefight is a measurement that has weight to it. In those 11 seconds, 2 fighters on the left ridge began advancing, moving by fire and maneuver, leapfrogging down the slope toward the valley floor. Sloan engaged one with his rifle, the one-handed, his left arm held against his body. Pruitt took the other. Both went down, but more were moving. There were always more. Rourke conducted his assessment. He looked at Farrell, head shake, no comms. He looked at Callahan, back on the gun, but holding up 2 fingers. 2 magazines remaining. He looked at his own vest. 3. He looked at the ridgeline and counted the muzzle flashes still active. 14 positions. None of them had stopped. He had been in bad situations before. Ramadi in 2006, a village in Helmand in 2011 that he still dreamed about occasionally, a building in Mosul in 2016 where 3 of them had held a stairwell for 4 hours waiting for support that arrived with 40 minutes to spare. He had been in situations where the math did not work and the outcome had been acceptable anyway. This situation was different. He could feel the difference the way you feel a temperature change as a physical fact, not an opinion. He pressed transmit. Any station, any station. This is SEAL Troop 2, grid November, Kilo 4478. We are in heavy contact. 6 personnel, taking fire from high ground both sides. Request immediate C, AS, and extraction. Any station. Silence. He tried again. His voice was level. It cost him something to keep it that way, and he paid the cost without thinking about it because the alternative cost more. Troop 2. We have 14 armed hostiles. Surrounded. No extraction possible. Ammunition critical. He stopped. He listened to the static. He looked at the men around him, one more time at Callahan burning through the second-to-last belt at Madsen, working on Sloan's arm in the dark, while Sloan kept his rifle up and kept scanning at Pruitt, methodically placing rounds on targets that kept being replaced by new ones at Farrell, trying the radio for what they both knew was the last time. Rourke pressed transmit. We're dead. All of us. We're dead. He set the radio down. He picked up his rifle. He was sighting on a muzzle flash on the right ridgeline, controlling his breath, beginning the process of doing what he could with what he had when the first shot came from the eastern wall, not from the ridge above them, not from either side of the kill zone. From the eastern wall of the ravine, the wall that faced them, the wall that was not in anyone's tactical plan because it was 60 meters of open ground away from their position and offered no obvious approach and should have been, for all practical purposes, irrelevant. The shot was suppressed. In the context of sustained automatic fire from multiple positions, a suppressed rifle is a sound you might miss entirely. Rourke did not miss it. After 20 years, his ears had developed a taxonomy of gunfire that operated below conscious thought. A fighter on the right ridgeline stopped. Not dramatically. He was there, and then he was not there, and the firing position he had occupied was empty, and the geometry of the incoming fire had just changed. The second shot came 4 seconds later. Another position. The same result. 4 seconds. The interval was precise. Not the rhythm of someone working quickly, but the rhythm of someone who has decided on a cadence and is executing it without deviation, which is a different thing entirely and considerably harder. The third shot. The fourth. Each one finding a position that had been active and leaving it quiet. On the ridgelines, the confusion was spreading visibly even through night vision. The fighters could not locate the source. The suppressor eliminated the muzzle flash. The angle of the incoming fire came from a direction they had not prepared for and had not apparently considered. Some of them broke position, moving to find cover from this new and invisible threat, which meant they were stepping into new angles, which meant the shooter on the eastern wall had anticipated this and was already adjusting. The fifth shot, the sixth, seventh, eighth. Rourke realized he had stopped firing. Callahan had stopped. Everyone had stopped. They were watching the ridgelines through their night vision and watching the positions go quiet one by one, and none of them had words for what they were watching. Then the ninth and 10th shots came differently. One of the fighters on the left ridge had broken entirely, not to find cover, but to run, moving along the ridgeline parallel to the valley floor, fast, using the terrain to stay low. In thermal, he was a hot shape moving against cold rock. The eastern wall tracked him. The first shot came and hit, and the man stumbled, but kept moving. The second shot came 1.8 seconds after the first. Not 4 seconds. Not the cadence. Faster, instinctive, adjusted, fired without the full cycle of the established rhythm. The second shot connected. The man stopped moving. Rourke noted the break in the cadence. He noted the way the second shot had come, the compressed timing, the adjustment that had to have been made on the fly. He did not know what it meant yet. He stored it. 11, 12, 13. The valley was almost quiet now. What had been a sustained firefight from 14 positions had reduced to the occasional round from fighters who were confused and repositioning and no longer presenting as coordinated threats. Pruitt and Farrell engaged two of the remaining fighters on the right from their cover. The left ridgeline was silent. The 14th fighter, the one who appeared to be directing the others based on his position and his radio traffic, which Farrell had been monitoring in fragments, abandoned his elevated position and moved along the upper ridgeline in a low run, heading north, trying to open distance. The eastern wall tracked him for the span of a breath, found the angle, and the movement on the ridge stopped. 14, 81 seconds from the first shot to the last. Rourke did not move for a long moment. None of them did. The silence after sustained gunfire has a particular quality. Not peaceful, not safe, but hollow in a specific way, as if the air itself needs time to understand what has changed. The ringing in Rourke's ears was beginning to resolve into something more like normal hearing. Madsen was the first to speak, and what he said was not a complete sentence, and it did not need to be. Perimeter, Rourke said. They moved. They checked the ridgelines and the valley floor and the approaches from the north and south. They confirmed what the firing had suggested. 14 positions, 14 fighters, none of them presenting any further threat. No friendly casualties beyond Sloan's shrapnel wound, which Madsen had dressed and which Sloan had continued to function through without complaint or drama, which Rourke made a mental note about. Farrell reported that the jamming had stopped. He was getting intermittent signal enough to begin the process of raising someone at JSOC, not the station, not Jalalabad, but JSOC directly, because something about the jamming and the prepared ambush and the frequencies that had been known in advance was telling him the same thing it was telling Rourke, and neither of them had said it out loud yet. Rourke stood in the center of the ravine and looked at the eastern wall. The cliff face rose roughly 70 feet. Not a route he would have chosen, the loose rock limited features exposure at every stage of the climb, but near the top, partially concealed by an overhang that would have been invisible from both ridgelines, something had shifted. A shadow that had not been there when they inserted. He watched it. The shadow moved, slowly at first. Then a rope appeared over the lip of the overhang, rigged before the firefight, which meant whoever had placed it had been on that wall before the first shot was fired. The figure descended with the careful deliberateness of someone managing fatigue while maintaining discipline. It took 11 minutes to reach the valley floor. Rourke held his weapon at low ready for the first 9 of those minutes. He lowered it at the 10th, not because the situation was resolved, but because something in the quality of the movement told him what he was looking at was not a threat. The figure dropped the last 4 feet in a controlled crouch. Stood. Turned. Through the NVG, the outline was clear. Small frame, 5'3" at most. A rifle on a single-point sling that was obviously too large for the person carrying it, an Accuracy International AXMC in .33 or E8. A weapon that weighed 14 pounds without the scope and was designed for shooters who had more mass behind it than this person appeared to. Hair pulled back. Standing still, breathing harder than the controlled descent had suggested, the chest moving with the effort that the climb had actually cost. Rourke walked toward her. He stopped 6 feet away. She looked at him steadily. Even in the green wash of night vision, he could see the right hand, the trigger hand, moving with a fine involuntary tremor. He had seen that tremor before. He had experienced it himself years ago after situations that had required things of him that the body then needed time to process. It was adrenaline stepping back and leaving the nervous system alone with what it had just done. He asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Are you hurt?" She looked at him, at Sloan who was holding his forearm, at Callahan who had set the M24OB down and was watching her with an expression that Rourke could not fully read. "No," she said. A pause. She looked at the ridge lines above them, then back at Rourke. "Second element will come," she said. "Not tonight, but we shouldn't be here when it does." "Who are you?" Rourke said. She looked at him for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much to give and in what order. Lena Hartwell. The name meant nothing to him. He waited. She seemed to understand that he was waiting, and that the waiting was not impatience but the particular quality of attention that experienced people give to information that matters. She gave him a fraction more. "I wasn't looking for you," she said. "I've been watching this valley for 7 days. Your team walked into a position I could see closing from 800 meters away. I had time to reach the eastern wall." She paused. "That's all." Rourke looked at the rifle on her back, at the left hand which was wrapped with electrical tape over what appeared to be older tape, over what appeared to be an injury that predated tonight. At the right hand where the tremor was already beginning to subside as she stood there, controlled by the same discipline that had kept the 4-second cadence through 11 consecutive shots. "You know a position," he said, 3 kilometers northeast. "I've been using it for 11 days. They don't know it exists." He looked at his team. Farrell nodded once intermittent signal, not solid but something. Callahan was already moving, picking up extra ammunition from the nearest abandoned fighting position, adding to what he carried because that was what Callahan did. "Take point," Rourke said to her. "Anything feels wrong, you stop. You don't decide alone. You stop and tell me." She turned and started walking north. The team fell in. Rourke positioned himself just behind her left shoulder where he could watch both her and the terrain ahead simultaneously. He watched her move, economical, quiet, choosing lines through the dark that a person unfamiliar with this ground could not have chosen. She did not hesitate at obstacles. She selected the correct path through terrain that was not on any map because she had learned it the hard way, one careful step at a time over 11 nights. Behind him, Callahan fell into step with the weight of the extra ammunition and the weight of everything else that Callahan carried, and said nothing. The mountains held their positions, and the dark held what it held, and the eastern wall stood empty behind them where a shadow had been. Whatever she was, whatever had brought her here, it had saved their lives. Most of them, but that belongs to another part of the night. The position was a shallow depression in the rock face beneath an overhang that would have been invisible from the ridge above and the valley below. Lena had lined the floor with a thermal blanket and had cached water, food, and a battery pack for communications equipment with the methodical foresight of someone who had planned to be here for a long time and alone. She had been sleeping on rock for 11 days. The way she lowered herself to the ground when they arrived carefully with the measured economy of someone managing chronic discomfort that has become too familiar to mention said everything about what those 11 days had cost. Rourke sat across from her and said nothing for a while. Madsen examined Sloane's arm under a red-filtered light and cleaned the wound and closed it with the quiet efficiency that distinguished a good corpsman from a great one. Pruitt and Farrell took up positions covering the 2 approach angles that Lena had identified without being asked. Callahan sat with his back against the far wall and began cataloging the ammunition he had collected from the abandoned positions, which was a reasonable thing to do, and also the thing Callahan always did when he needed something to do with his hands. Lena ate from a ration pouch not with appetite, but with the mechanical obligation of a person fueling a machine that still had work to do. She drank from a nearly empty water bottle. She was aware of Rourke watching her in the way that people who have spent extended time alone become aware of presence acutely without appearing to try. When she had finished, Madsen moved to her without being asked and looked at the taped left hand. She let him work without comment. "How long?" he said. 6 days. Rockfall on the approach. 2 fingers. I don't think they're broken." "They're not broken," he said, examining them. "But you've been shooting on this for 6 days. The right hand does most of the work." Madsen looked at her with the specific expression of a corpsman who understands exactly what the person is not saying and has decided that the time for having that conversation is not now. He wrapped the hand in fresh tape, even and firm. Rourke waited until Madsen had returned to his position. "Tell me why you're here," he said. She looked at him directly. "My father came into Afghanistan on the 3rd of September. He had civilian contractor status on paper. That wasn't what he was doing. What was he doing? He spent 30 years in the military and several years afterward paying attention to how money moved in conflict zones. Reconstruction contracts, infrastructure funding, the gap between what was allocated and what was built. She looked at the wall of the overhang. He had been following a specific set of contracts in Kunar and Nuristan provinces. Money that was supposed to build roads and schools and water systems. He thought he knew where the money was actually going. He came here to confirm it because the paper trail ends at a certain point, and the only way past it is to talk to people on the ground who watch the projects not get built. This is private, Rourke said. He came without authorization. He came without official authorization, yes. She met his eyes, because official channels were the problem. Rourke understood this. He had spent 20 years watching official channels protect themselves from information they found inconvenient. He transmitted on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of September. Then nothing. I had placed a GPS tracker in his equipment before he left. He didn't know. The device showed him stationary for 3 days northeast of here, then a single movement on the 9th about 4 kilometers, and then nothing again. You didn't report it, he said. My father was operating without authorization in an active combat zone. Any official report immediately draws attention to what he was doing and why. The people with careers to protect tend to respond to that kind of threat before they address the actual problem. She said this without bitterness as a statement of demonstrated fact. I reported to the one person I trusted. She told me the same thing I already knew. So you came yourself? I came myself. Farrell appeared at Rourke's shoulder. His voice was low and tightly controlled. Sir, I've been monitoring traffic on the captured radio. Dari, I have enough to work with. He held the device where Rourke could see the screens showing the intercepted timestamp. Approximately 30 minutes ago, a transmission from the northwest was asking for confirmation that the operation was complete. When the fighters here didn't respond, there was a second voice. Different location. Northeast. Signal strength suggests 10 to 15 kilometers. Rourke was very still. He looked at Lena. She had been listening without appearing to listen. She met his eyes, and he could see she had already put the geography together with what she was carrying. Tell him, she said quietly. Farrell continued. The northeast transmission included a grid reference. He said the grid. Lena reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and removed a device that resembled a GPS unit but was not a standard model modified with custom firmware that she had built herself over 3 months before her father left. She turned it on. The screen illuminated dimly. A single blinking dot. She turned it toward Rourke. The dot was moving, slowly, irregularly, in the pattern of someone being moved by others rather than walking freely. The grid coordinate matched what Farrell had intercepted to within 200 meters. That's him, she said. That's the tracker. He's alive, Rourke said. He's alive. She looked at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, then she made herself look away, which was a thing that cost her something. And someone in the northeast has just lost communication with the fighters they sent to kill your team. When they figure out what that means, the value calculation on my father changes. Rourke thought about the briefing that had sent his team into this valley. The specific grid coordinates, the precise timeline, the frequencies that had been jammed, the prepared ambush waiting exactly where they had been told to be. The mission briefing, he said, it went through the station at Jalalabad, CIA. The intelligence that generated it came from the station chief. Elliot Vance, she said. He looked at her. You know him. My father mentioned him in his last transmission. He said Vance had been unhelpful when he tried to access certain contractor records through official channels. Not obstructive unhelpful. There's a difference. Obstructive suggests awareness of a problem. Unhelpful might just be institutional protection. You're not blaming him. I don't know enough to blame him. She looked at the intercepted radio. What I know is that someone in your briefing chain knew your exact route and frequencies. That chain runs through the station. Vance runs the station. What I don't know is whether Vance is the source, whether someone below him is the source, or whether the station has a security vulnerability that Vance knows about and has chosen not to address because addressing it creates more problems than it solves. She paused. All 3 of those situations produce the same outcome for your team. None of them require Vance to be a traitor. The third one only requires him to be a coward. Pruitt, from his position at the south approach, said without turning his head, Doesn't make us less dead, ma'am. No, she said, it doesn't. Rourke sat with this. He had spent 20 years operating in the space between clear-cut decisions and had developed a particular patience with complexity. This was complex. The complexity did not change the operational facts, which were that his team had been ambushed through a failure in their intelligence chain, that 6 of them were alive because of someone who should not have been in this valley, and that somewhere 14 kilometers northeast, a 54-year-old man with a GPS tracker in his equipment was being moved to a location that would become significantly more difficult to reach once the people moving him understood what had happened tonight. How long, he said, before they know their element didn't check in? She looked at the tracker. Someone is already wondering. Within 2 hours, they'll send to investigate. Add travel time. The tracker shows continuous movement. He's ambulatory, which changes the extraction math. If we move now, we can be within range of the target area before they understand the full picture. She looked at him steadily. 6 hours, maybe 7. The position was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up in the pines. Rourke stood and moved to where Callahan was sitting against the far wall. He crouched down. Callahan looked up. Warren Hartwell, Rourke said. Force Recon, her father. Callahan's expression shifted the way a key shifts in a lock, something finding its place. Fallujah, he said, his second battle, November 2004. You knew him. I knew the call sign. Our element was alongside a recon team for a week during the Ascari push. Their team leader. Call sign was Ironwood. He was quiet for a moment. That was Hartwell. His daughter says so. Callahan looked at the ground between his boots. He stayed there for a moment. When he raised his eyes to Rourke, he said one word. Sir. In 15 years of working alongside Callahan, Rourke had learned what that word meant in that particular register. It was not a question and not a request and not deference to rank. It was older than any of those things. It was the sound of one man telling another that he understood what was at stake in a way that the formal vocabulary of military service did not have words for. Rourke stood. He looked at his team, at Farrell working the captured radio with patient focus, pulling fragments of intelligence from the traffic and building a picture, at Madsen reorganizing his kit with the specific care of a man who expects to need it again soon and wants everything in its correct place when he does, at Pruitt scanning the approach that faced north without having been told to watch the north, at Sloan, who was watching Rourke with the complete attention of someone on his first deployment who has spent the past hour closer to death than he knew was possible and has decided very quietly to follow the man with 20 years of experience wherever that man goes. At Callahan, who had already picked up the M240B, Rourke turned to Lena. She was watching him. She had not asked. He recognized this as a deliberate choice. She had laid out the information, she had let the logic make the case, and she had stopped. She understood that asking would be the wrong move, and she had the discipline not to make it. The plan will have holes, Rourke said. I'm telling you now, we don't have the time or the resources to close them all. There will be at least 2 points where we're accepting risk we can't mitigate. I know, she said. Your role is navigation and overwatch. You know the ground. In the field, you take direction from me. Understood. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because 2 different people making command decisions in the same space without coordination is how people on the same side shoot each other. I know how it works, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and began the process of bringing his team from rest to movement, and the position that had been a temporary refuge became a place they were leaving, and the night that had already been too long grew longer around them as they moved northeast toward the second part of what this night was going to require. The plan took 40 minutes to build and had 2 holes in it that neither of them could close. Rourke named them plainly because in his experience, men who did not name the problems in a plan were consistently surprised by them later, and surprise at the wrong moment in the wrong place was not distinguishable from failure. The first hole was the approach to the target area. Between the end of the pine cover on the western slope and the base of the structure that the tracker and the intercepted coordinates pointed to, there was approximately 400 meters of open ground. Exposed rock, no cover uphill in full kit. In total darkness, they could cross it slowly. In the growing light, they could cross it quickly but visibly. The window between moving fast enough to matter and being visible enough to be engaged from above was approximately 20 minutes, bracketed by first light at 0607. The second hole was the withdrawal with Warren Hartwell. They did not know his condition. A man who had been held for 11 days in unknown circumstances could be ambulatory and functional, or he could not, and they would not know which until they had him. Moving with a compromised casualty for 7 kilometers to an extraction LZ while potentially in contact was not a plan with a good answer. It was a direction with a variable attached to it that they could not resolve in advance. Rourke named both holes and said nothing further about them because there was nothing further to say. Lena observed that the tracker had shown continuous movement, which suggested Warren was walking under his own power, which was evidence against the worst version of the second hole. Rourke agreed that this changed the math. He did not say the hole was closed. He assigned positions. Lena would take overwatch on a rock formation on the western slope above the target area, an angle she had identified from the topo and confirmed on her reconnaissance passes, which gave her coverage over the approach and the most likely withdrawal route simultaneously. Callahan, Pruitt, and Rourke would form the assault element. Madsen would move with them because they did not know what Warren Hartwell would need on the other side of the door. Farrell and Sloan would hold the tree line with the communications equipment, maintaining the JSOC link that had finally come solid at 0451 when the signal cleared enough to push a full sitrep through directly to Joint Special Operations Command, bypassing the station at Jalalabad entirely. The sitrep contained what had happened: the ambush, the jamming, the frequencies, the grid coordinates that had appeared in the intercepted radio traffic, the dots that connected to the station briefing. It contained all of this as observed fact without conclusion because the facts were enough, and conclusions could be drawn by people with more access to the full picture. Rourke did not know what would happen to that sitrep. He knew it had gone to the right people. What those people did with it was outside his control and outside the scope of what the next 3 hours required him to think about. They moved at 0500. The approach to the tree line took 90 minutes over ground that Lena navigated from memory, choosing routes that kept them below the ridgelines and out of sight of the high ground to the northeast. The growing light was an asset on this leg, enough to see clearly, not enough to be seen from distance against the dark slope. At the tree line, Lena identified the overwatch position she had selected and moved to it with the unhurried precision of someone going to a place she has been before. She checked the AXMC chamber scope settings bipod with the automatic completeness of someone who does not need to think about the sequence to execute it correctly. She assessed the wind. At this elevation, northeast at approximately 11 knots, with the variance at distance that the terrain induced. She made her adjustments without speaking. She looked at Rourke. "I have the approach in the primary withdrawal route from here," she said. "The dead ground on the north side of the structure is approximately 60 meters. You will lose overwatch coverage in those 60 meters. Understood. If you are in that dead ground and taking fire from above, I cannot help you." Understood. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite something he could name. "Come out the south side," she said. "We'll treat by." That was the end of it. She turned back to her scope and Rourke looked at the team that was going with him, and the second hole in the plan was still there, unchanged by any of what had just been said. He checked his watch, 5:57, 10 minutes to the window. He used the time to stand still and look at the target area from the tree line. The structure was stone, the kind that had been built in these mountains for centuries before anyone had words like fortified position. It connected via a low wall to a smaller secondary structure on the north side forming a rough compound. Single main entrance on the east face. A secondary opening on the south wall. Lena had identified this on her reconnaissance passes. High ground on the north and east. The western approach was the least covered angle, which meant it was also the angle most likely to be watched for exactly that reason. The first hole was still there too. At 0601 he moved. The 400 meters took 5 minutes and 20 seconds. They moved in a staggered line using the undulations in the open slope for what cover they provided, which was not much. Rourke moved forward and felt the exposure the way you feel a temperature change, as a physical reality, the openness of the terrain above and around them, the sensation of being watched even when the scopes and the movement and the intelligence all said the watchers were inside and looking east. No fire came. They hit the dead ground at the base of the compound at 0606. Rourke signaled Callahan left, Pruitt right. He and Madsen went to the south opening. Inside the dead ground, the overwatch position above them was useless, which meant the next minutes were theirs entirely. Their training, their movement, their decisions in rooms they had not seen. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the product of 15 years of doing the same fundamental thing in different buildings in different countries. The geometry of entry and clearance, the allocation of space and angle, the language of movement that is no longer language because it has become reflex. Rourke moved through the south opening, and Madsen followed, and Pruitt came in from the right, and Callahan from the left, and the compound resolved itself into known space, room by room the way compounds always did. The first room was empty. Storage. Old equipment, nothing recent. The room adjacent to it, the one that Warren's last position had suggested, was also empty, cleared within the past hour from the look of the space. A bedroll recently abandoned. Food containers, a water vessel still half full. Rourke moved deeper. The main room eastern faced second door on the right. Warren Hartwell was seated against the far wall with his back straight and his hands bound in front of him with plastic restraint and his eyes open and immediately tracking when Rourke came through the door. He was 54 years old and he had the cut above his left eye that had healed badly over 11 days and the bruising along his jaw that had gone from purple to the specific yellow-green of old damage. He was thin in the way a man gets thin when nutrition has been irregular and sleep has been worse. He looked at Rourke's kit in his face and he said with a composure that told Rourke everything about who this man was. I was starting to wonder. Madsen cut the restraints. Warren stood carefully with the deliberateness of a man whose legs have been in one position for hours, and when he was upright, he stood straight, which was the most informative thing about his condition. Madsen ran his 10-second assessment pulse tracking ambulation. Warren passed all three. How many? Rourke said. 4 on my last count. 3 hours ago, 1 outside the north wall, 2 in the courtyard, 1 in the room I was just moved from. He rotated his wrist slowly. They moved me an hour ago. The room adjacent. I don't know why. Rourke knew why. The transmission from the northeast had prompted movement before the reason for it was understood. A precaution. The kind of thing you do when something has gone quiet that should not be quiet. Pruitt had cleared the adjacent room already and found it empty, which accounted for 1 of the 4. The north wall and the courtyard were still unknowns. He signaled Callahan 2 fingers for the courtyard question for the north. Callahan moved to the south opening and checked the angle. 2 fingers back, both in the courtyard. He shook his head on the north, could not determine, which meant the north was 1 man or empty. They moved. Rourke took Warren's left arm and Madsen took the right. Callahan went through the south opening first because Callahan, with a belt-fed machine gun in an open courtyard, was a considerably better equation than Callahan with a belt-fed machine gun in a confined stone room, and Callahan understood this without needing it explained. The courtyard resolved quickly. 2 fighters who had been sitting against the eastern wall heard the south opening and turned, and neither of them had time to complete the turn. Pruitt came through the opening 2 seconds after Callahan and covered the angles Callahan had not covered, which was the correct sequence. The courtyard was clear. The north wall was not. The fighter at the north wall had not rotated away. He had moved from his position outside the compound to a point just inside the gap in the connecting wall between the main structure and the secondary building. The gap gave him an angle on the courtyard that the south opening had not covered. When Callahan moved into the courtyard, the fighter saw him from the gap at the same moment Callahan saw the fighter, and both of them reacted simultaneously, which meant neither reaction was clean. Callahan's first burst went slightly high. The fighter's shot went wide right. Callahan corrected, and the north wall threat ended, but the M240B in a stone compound is not a quiet resolution. The sound traveled. It went up the slopes and into the morning air, and it was heard by anyone in this part of the valley who was listening for it. Rourke had Warren moving toward the western approach before the echo finished. Madsen was 3 steps behind, with his kit already resealed. Pruitt covered the north gap. They were through the dead ground and onto the open slope before a second source of fire materialized. The second element was a patrol of 4 fighters moving along the upper ridgeline to the north, drawn by the sound of the machine gun. They came over the ridgeline at a run, weapons up, moving fast, and they came at precisely the moment that Rourke's element was on the open slope 400 meters from the tree line, the ground between them and cover offering nothing. The first fighter on the ridgeline fired once. The round hit dirt 3 feet left of Rourke. The second fighter was still coming over the crest. The third and fourth were behind him. Callahan turned. He did not announce it. He did not look at Rourke for permission or confirmation. He moved laterally to a low rock that gave him a partial angle on the ridgeline, and he brought the M240B up and he opened fire. The sound at that range on that slope was enormous, a physical pressure in the chest as much as a noise in the ears. At this volume and rate of fire, the machine gun did what machine guns are designed to do at the tactical level. It created a volume of fire that made forward movement impossible, that forced every person on the receiving end of it to find cover immediately, that bought time at the cost of position. Rourke used the time. He moved Warren across the open slope. Madsen was with him. Pruitt covered the left angle where the ridgeline curved and the patrol's flanking route ran. 60 meters, 100, 200. the tree line coming closer with each step. Farrell was already moving at the tree line, covering the approach as they came in. Sloan had the radio in one hand and his rifle in the other, and he was tracking the ridgeline above ready. They reached the tree line. Rourke turned. Callahan was still in position behind the low rock, firing in controlled bursts, keeping the ridgeline fighters suppressed. The four fighters had all gone to ground, two behind the natural cover of the ridgeline itself, two in depressions in the slope below the crest. The machine gun was keeping them there. One of the fighters on the ground on the north side had been watching Callahan's position and had identified the limitation of the low rock. The rock covered Callahan from the south and from the ridgeline directly above, but not from the north flank at the angle that this particular fighter was looking at. The fighter moved. Low, careful, using the terrain the way someone who has spent years in these mountains uses terrain. He found a position that gave him the angle. He fired. Callahan went down. Rourke was moving before the cognition fully formed. He covered the open ground between the tree line and Callahan's position at a run, exposed, not thinking about the exposure because the only calculation that was happening was the one about getting there. Madsen arrived one step behind him. The assessment took 4 seconds. Madsen's hands were already working before the 4 seconds ended, and the information in the movement of those hands was legible to Rourke in the way that information between people who have worked together for years becomes legible without words. From the ridge above, 2 shots came in rapid succession from the western slope, the overwatch position. Suppressed, precise. The fighters who had been engaging stopped engaging. Callahan was looking at the sky. The light was full morning, now clear and pale, the specific blue of high-altitude autumn in the mountains. He was breathing. His eyes found Rourke and held them. And what Rourke saw in those eyes was not fear and was not the confusion that sometimes came at this moment. It was something more like mild surprise, as if the morning had turned out to be different from what he had expected, and he was still working out whether that was significant. "The kid," Callahan said. His voice was his own voice. "Sloan? He did everything right," Rourke said. Callahan seemed to consider this. "Good," he said. "That's good." He was quiet for a moment. His breathing had developed the specific change that Rourke recognized. "Ironwood," Callahan said. "Fallujah, you got him out." "Yes," Rourke said. "Good." A pause. "Tell him I said." Then Callahan asked about the game. His son played youth football Saturday games, and Callahan had missed the last several Saturdays for reasons that were classified and would remain so. He asked Rourke if he knew how the team had done. Rourke did not know. He said the team had played well because it was the kind of thing that could be true, and because in 20 years Rourke had learned that there are moments when the precise truth matters less than the true thing, and the true thing was that somewhere a boy had played football on a Saturday, and his father had cared about it, while being in the mountains of Kunar province on the other side of the world. Callahan absorbed this. He seemed satisfied with it. Then he was quiet. Madsen remained in his position for a moment, after hands on his knees looking at the ground between his boots. He was a good corpsman. He had done everything right. Rourke did not say this to him because Madsen already knew it, and because there were situations where saying the right thing was indistinguishable from saying nothing, and this was one of them. "We move," Rourke said. The extraction helicopter came in at 0741. The 161st SOAR MH-60M dropped into the LZ 2 kilometers north of the position held for 40 seconds and was climbing west before the dust had finished settling. Rourke counted his people aboard. Farrell, Pruitt, Madsen, Sloan, Warren Hartwell, who needed help with the step-up and took it without comment. Lena was last at the LZ. She stood on the valley floor with the rifle on her back and the morning light on her face and the 11 days of the Korengal visible in every element of her posture, and she did not move toward the aircraft. Rourke held the door. "Get on the aircraft." "I'm not on your manifest." "I don't have a manifest." "Get on the aircraft, Hartwell." She looked at him for a moment, then she got on the aircraft. The valley fell away below them as the helicopter climbed toward the west. Through the window, the ridgelines that had been the entire world for the past several hours resolved into geography, terrain, features, elevation. Contours the shape of ground that neither remembered nor forgot what had passed over it. The Korengal continued being what it had always been. It did not mark the occasion. Warren Hartwell sat across from his daughter. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She looked back at him. He was 54 years old and thin and bruised and alive, and he was looking at her with the particular attention of a man who has spent 11 days composing things he needed to say and who has now discovered that none of the compositions were right. "You put a tracker in my equipment," he said. "Yes." Before I left without telling me. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Smart, he said simply. The helicopter flew west and the mountains moved below them. For a while, neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the specific silence of two people who have been at a distance that had nothing to do with geography and who are now, without having planned it, in the same aircraft on the same morning for reasons that neither of them could have anticipated. Madsen on the other side of the aircraft said something quiet to Rourke. Rourke watched them. Warren had turned to look out the window. Then he turned back. Madsen told me, he said, 14 shots, 81 seconds. She said nothing. He mentioned the 9th and 10th, that you broke your rhythm. She held his gaze. Warren Hartwell had spent 30 years in difficult places reading things that did not want to be read, terrain people situations that presented themselves one way and were in fact another way entirely. She had grown up under that attention. She knew exactly what it was capable of. She gave him nothing. He looked at her for a long moment in the way of a man who knows what he is looking at and has decided deliberately to let it stand. He was her father. He understood that there were things a person kept for themselves and that the keeping was not dishonesty, but the right kind of privacy, the kind that protected something that was still being examined. 14 shots, he said. That's what Madsen told me. She turned to the window. After a while, Warren said, when you were 16 and shooting at 800 meters, I told you there was a difference between calculated and instinctive. I said you needed both. I said you couldn't have one without the other. He looked at the restraint marks on his wrists, which had not yet faded. I was never sure you believed me. I believed you, she said, still looking at the window. I wasn't sure I could do both at the same time. And now she was quiet long enough that it became its own answer. When she spoke, it was not to his question. I should have called, she said. After Syria, after the discharge, I should have called. He turned to look at her fully. 3 years of distance that had not been distance in the geographical sense. He had waited for her to call, and she had waited for him to call, and neither of them had called, and 11 days in a stone room had reorganized his understanding of which things were important and in what order they were important. I should have called first, he said. She looked at him. It was not resolution, not the clean kind, not the kind that happens in a single conversation. It was something more like a door opening that had been closed and the light coming through the opening being real light and both of them being willing to stand in it. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Sloan was asleep against the bulkhead, which was the correct thing to be on your first deployment after a night like this one, and Rourke noted it with the specific appreciation of a man who recognized good instincts when he saw them. Pruitt was cleaning his weapon. Farrell was documenting the communications intelligence from the captured radio with the methodical attention of someone who understands that the work of the field does not end when the field does. Rourke looked at the floor of the aircraft and thought about Doyle Callahan. He thought about the extra magazines taped to the left shoulder strap and the 4 words that had explained them. He thought about the single word that Callahan had given him in the depression in the rock face when Rourke had said Ironwood's name. He thought about the football game and the answer he had given that was not precisely true and was true in the way that mattered. He thought about the rock on the open slope and the angle it did not cover and the fighter who had found the angle. There was a version in which Callahan ran with the rest of them, in which the timing shifted, in which the patrol crested the ridgeline from a different approach in which the angle from the north was not taken because the fighter who found it had moved left instead of right. That version existed in the space of all possible outcomes. The mathematics of the situation had not made it impossible, but it was not the version they were in. What they had was the version in which Doyle Callahan turned and moved to a position and created the time that was needed, and Callahan's version of the story ended on a clear September morning in the Kunar Mountains, while somewhere in America his son's team was warming up for a Saturday game that his father would never find out the result of. Rourke filed his report 3 days later. He filed it honestly and completely. The ambush, the jamming, the frequencies, the intercepted transmission, with the grid coordinates that matched his briefing, the chain of information that led to the station. He named Elliot Vance not as a traitor, but as a station chief in whose jurisdiction a pattern of operational security failures had occurred over a period that predated this mission and that had resulted directly and demonstrably in a prepared ambush on a team operating with intelligence sourced through his command. He noted the pattern. He noted the dates. He named the other incidents that Lena had documented over 11 days in the Korengal cross-referenced against the station's briefing history. He noted the transmission that Farrell had intercepted and the grid that it had contained. He submitted all of it and sent it to JSOC directly. And from JSOC, it went to the appropriate oversight structure, and what happened after that moved at the speed that institutional investigations move. Elliot Vance was placed on administrative leave within the week. Whether the investigation would conclude with anything actionable was a question that did not have an answer in the weeks that followed. The system that had produced the failure was investigating itself. This was not the same as accountability. It was also not nothing. Lena Hartwell appeared before a military review board in October. The charges were precise: conducting unauthorized intelligence activities in a foreign combat zone, weapons possession without authorization, entry under false documentation. The board reviewed the circumstances. 6 SEAL operators submitted testimony that no one had asked them to submit, and they submitted it with the specific thoroughness of people who had decided what the record was going to say. The board deliberated for 2 days and issued a finding that described the situation as extraordinarily complex and deferred final disposition pending further review, which was not resolution, which was not vindication, which was a door left ajar in a hallway with more hallways beyond it, which was perhaps the most honest possible representation of where things actually stood. She drove to Virginia in the first week of November. The cemetery was on a hillside in a county she had not been to before. The morning was cold and clear in the way of Virginia in November. Not the killing cold of the Kunar Mountains, but the quiet cold of a season that has accepted what it is and is no longer arguing about it. The stone was new enough that the edges were still sharp. The engraving had not yet begun to weather. Doyle Patrick Callahan, Petty Officer, 1st Class, United States Navy, November 12, 1980, September 14, 2019. She stood in front of it. There was nothing to say that the stone did not already hold, and she had not driven to Virginia to say anything. She had come to stand in this specific place and be in the presence of the weight that this specific place contained. Because she had understood in the weeks since Afghanistan that the 81 seconds on the Eastern Wall would only mean what they meant if she allowed them to mean it, if she looked at the full accounting without adjusting the numbers for her comfort. The full accounting was this: she had made 14 shots and they had been enough for 5 men to reach a helicopter and not enough for the 6th man to reach it with them. The 6th man had made his own decision on the open slope with full knowledge of what decisions cost in places like that slope, and that decision had been his to make and his alone. She had not asked him to make it. She could not have stopped him. The weight of it was still hers to carry, because weight distributes to the people who were there, regardless of what they asked for or didn't ask for. She carried this. She also carried something else, and she carried it alone. 2 of the 14 shots had been different from the others. She had broken the cadence, fired on instinct, and connected. And she could not tell you, standing at that stone in the November cold, how much of those 2 shots belonged to her training and how much belonged to the variables that morning had arranged in her favor. She had the number. She knew the number. She was keeping it, not out of shame, not to protect a reputation that was at the moment pending review by a military board. She was keeping it because it was hers, because the honest accounting of what a person actually did and what they got away with was something a person owed to themselves and to the people they had been in the field with, and because the weight of the true number was the correct weight to carry, and she intended to carry the correct weight. Warren Hartwell stood to her left, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He had driven separately and arrived 10 minutes after her and had not spoken when he arrived. He was 54 years old and standing on a Virginia hillside in November because his daughter had come into the Korengal after him, and the weight of that was something that had reorganized every other weight he had been carrying, and he was choosing to stand in it rather than away from it. Rourke arrived at 9. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia. The kind of clothes a man wears when he wants to be himself rather than his rank. He stopped at the stone and stood straight the way he could not entirely stop himself from standing, and he remained there for a long time. Corbett Sloan stood beside him, 26 years old. His first deployment, and already carrying the specific understanding that some things do not prepare you for themselves until you are inside them, and that being inside them and still standing afterward is the beginning of something, not the end. He stood with his eyes forward and did not look away. The wind came across the hillside and moved through the bare November trees and continued past them without slowing. After a while, Rourke took a step forward and stood beside Lena. He looked at the stone. He asked about the game, Rourke said. His voice was quiet and level. At the end, his son's team, I told him they'd played well. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't know that? No. It was the right thing to say. That's what I thought, he said. They stood there. The November light was level and pale. the kind of light that does not favor or flatter anything that shows things as they are. Below the hill, a road ran between bare trees, and on the road a car passed without slowing, because the world does not slow for this, because the world does not know when it should. Lena reached out and touched the top edge of the stone. Once. The granite was cold. She felt the cold in her fingertips and held it for a moment, and then dropped her hand. Doyle Callahan had taped 2 extra magazines to his shoulder strap before every mission for 15 years, because experience had taught him that preparation for the next problem was the only honest response to uncertainty. He had turned on an open slope in the Kunar Mountains and put his body between a machine gun and the people who needed to reach the tree line because that was the correct thing to do, and he was the person in the position to do it, and he had done it without being asked, which was the purest possible version of it. She understood now, standing at this stone, that this was what the weight of the Korengal actually was. Not the 14 shots, not the 81 seconds, not the 2 shots whose true attribution she would carry privately for the rest of her life. The weight was this: a man who had turned back and a boy somewhere who had played a game on a Saturday without knowing that his father's last question had been about that game and the answer that Rourke had given, which was not precisely true, and was true in the way that mattered. She stood in front of the stone until she was ready. Then she turned. The hillside continued down to the road, and the trees and the ordinary world that continued without regard for any of this, and Rourke fell in on her right, and Warren fell in on her left, and Sloan and Farrell and Pruitt behind them without formation, without order. The way people fall in around each other when they have been through something that has made them without ceremony or announcement responsible to one another. They walked down the hill. Behind them, the stone stood in the November cold with its sharp new edges and its 4 lines of engraved text, and the wind moved through the bare trees the way wind moves through everything, without interest in what it passes, without memory of where it has been, without any knowledge of what the people walking down the hill were carrying, or how long they would carry it, or how it would change the shape of who they became. They carried it anyway. That is what you do with the weight that belongs to you. You carry it and you keep walking, and eventually the walking becomes the carrying, and the carrying becomes the walking. And somewhere in that process, not resolved, not forgotten, but integrated into the grain of who you are, you find that you are still moving forward. The morning held them in its cold and level light. They kept walking.